Radio TV Phono Nut here, and our new meter came in today. This is a Mastech, courtesy of Motorola Electronics. I think it was about $43 and some change with the shipping and tax and all that good stuff, and was shipped to me via UPS second day air. And what do you know, it actually showed up on time. I don't think the post office could have done that. And so yeah, we went from yellow to green here, and this meter appears to be, as far as its functions go, similar to what the old one was. We have AC and DC voltage measurement, resistance, diode check, and continuity on the same setting, and you use this yellow button to select between the three. Capacitance and current test and temperature, and we can measure frequency on this, but I don't think this will go up really high enough, say, to check the, oh, here it comes again. So I don't think this will go up high enough to check the, say, the IF frequency on coming out of a signal generator. On that note, I really need to invest in a frequency counter so I can at least check the accuracy of all of these old school RF generators that I have kicking around here. This operates on 3 AAA batteries and has a tilt stand where you can prop the meter up for easy viewing, which is something the other one didn't have. And this one, you change the batteries by moving the stand back and removing 2 screws that hold the battery cover in place. Really not too crazy about these modern safety probes where they have most of the probe tip covered up. I can see why they do it, but sometimes it makes it easier to have a full exposed probe tip, especially if you want to, say, connect your negative lead to the chassis or connect an alligator clip lead to your probe tips to make a permanent connection, or a hands-free connection, I should say. Now, on my yellow meter, somebody commented in the last video that probably all it needed was the battery changed, because that can cause false and erratic readings. And yes, the battery low indicator has been on for quite some time with that meter, but I mean, yeah, I agree with that. I've experienced that in the past with that meter, but I also know that meter has about reached the end of its useful life. The display had gotten to the point that unless I looked at it at a certain angle, it appeared that the whole display was turned on. And also the selector switch is starting to wear out. It's gotten to the point that I could clean it and it would work okay for a little while, and then it would start becoming erratic again. So that's the reason I just decided just to go ahead and order another meter, and we'll use this one until it craps out. Now, as far as these digital meters, they're available in all different price ranges, from under $20 to hundreds of dollars, if not more. But for just doing general work on radios and TVs and phonographs, you don't really need a meter that costs hundreds of dollars. A $40 or $50 meter will usually do just fine. In fact, even the $15 or $20 cheapie will often do just fine. It just may not be quite as durable as something like this here. Now, how long this meter will last is anybody's guess, but you know, I figure if I get a few years out of it, it will have paid for itself, and I'll just go get another meter. Now, the yellow meter, I might try to patch it up just enough to have for backup use, or in case I run into a situation where I need 2 meters, but this green meter is going to become my primary meter. And really, your multimeter will be your most used tool in troubleshooting electronics. If you don't have a decent multimeter, you might as well just stay off the workbench. And if you've noticed in most of my videos, a multimeter is the most used piece of equipment that I employ in my troubleshooting. Yes, we sometimes need oscilloscopes and signal generators and such things as that to make life a little easier, but this thing I'm holding in my hand will be your most used tool in troubleshooting equipment. Now with that said, here's our next little project, a Motorola 3-speed phonograph from 1956. This is a one-tube wonder job, but it's a bit better constructed than most of your typical 50s and 60s one-tube wonder record players, and Motorola stuff was pretty well made. This uses the standard 3-speed Alliance motor with a metal flock turntable platter, and the flocking is still in good shape. Power cord still looks to be in good shape. We're in a wooden cabinet that's covered with this, I don't know, photo finish or whatever this stuff is. We've got a nice metal tone arm that's made by Shure, and it has a Shure crystal cartridge in it, which I'm sure is dead by now. We'll probably end up replacing that with an static 89T school record player cartridge, since this tone arm uses standard half-inch cartridge mounting. I haven't measured the tracking pressure of this, but it doesn't feel to be that heavy for one of these. So in an 89T cartridge, it still won't give us the volume level that this 3-volt cartridge would give us, but an 89T will usually kick these things to be loud enough for personal use anyway, and it will save me from having to build an extra driver stage on the amplifier. The case is in decent shape except for this spot right here where it feels like the photo finish or whatever it is worn off. Really not much I can do about that, but it could be a whole lot worse. This one also has some pretty beefy screws holding it together too, so just another testament to its quality. Of course, I've already plugged this in, and it has the usual problems: drive mechanism needing to be cleaned and lubricated, and amplifier hums like crazy because of bad capacitors, and I'm sure the cartridge is dead too, so we'll fix all that. Well, here's our amplifier and motor and speaker. Nothing really that unusual. It uses a single 25CA5 tube, which I believe is a higher gain version of a 25C5. So yeah, this thing should work okay with a 89T cartridge in it. Here's our amplifier exposed, our selenium rectifier that will be changed out to a silicon diode. There's our filter capacitor down there. Good old .047 microfarad bumblebee cap that isolates the chassis from circuit ground. I'm sure I could sell that on eBay for what I paid for the whole record player. And we got another one of these white ceramic case jobs for our tone control, and then a disc capacitor that looks like it couples the cartridge to the amplifier input. This one's probably not going to be the easiest thing to work on because everything's so far down in here, but we'll get it done. Okay, in order to make this a little bit easier to work on, I just removed the amplifier completely from the rest of the phonograph. That way I can hold this in various angles and positions and not have the rest of the phonograph getting in my way. Well, I can tell you this amp is not the easiest thing to work on due to this deep chassis and the way they have everything laid out. And you can see I'm having to bend the chassis back a little bit where I can gain a little bit better access. Of course, I'll straighten it back up when we're done. I was hoping not to have to fool with any of the resistors. I was hoping for this to be as easy as possible, but looks like I'm going to have to. There's only 2 resistors in here. The screen grid dropping resistor, which is 2.2K. It's reading 1.8K. I'm not really worried about that. It's not a problem, but due to the nature of this, I'm probably going to go ahead and change it while I'm in there to prevent any further need of service down the road. The cathode resistor is supposed to be 180 ohm. It's reading 276 ohms. Well, I take that back. There is a 3rd resistor coming off of the selenium rectifier here. It looks like a blurry 120 ohms. But it don't matter because that's probably going to get replaced with a higher value resistor once I convert this to a silicon rectifier. Okay, you can talk about me if you want to. I don't care. Trying to be neat and get all the old component lead out of the tube socket, it doesn't want to cooperate and come out. And when you're bending and twisting and prodding on tube socket terminals, that's when they break off. So guess what's going to happen? We have a through hole for the necessary new components. The remains of those old component leads can just stay wrapped around there. And if anybody don't like it, then they can talk about me in 50 years when somebody opens this up and checks it out. But I'm not going to risk breaking a tube socket off, tearing up a tube socket, just to make this thing look ultra neat. Well, we're getting there with this, but it's about time to call it a day. I just heard some gunshots in the distance, and you know how it is nowadays when you got thugs raising babies, then the offspring goes from wearing huggies to being thuggies in no time, and then that's what you got. You know, monkey see, monkey do, and it's just the way it works. So I think I'm going to hightail my butt out of here, and we will continue this tomorrow. Now, this would have been a 15-minute overhaul had this, well, maybe a little longer than 15 minutes, maybe 30 or 45 minutes, but since this chassis is so servicer friendly, then we're having to take extra steps, and it's taken a lot more time than I would have really have liked for it to have taken, but we're getting there with it. This is our AC input terminal strip here. Our power cord and one end of our motor will go here, and then there'll be a dropping resistor between here and our anode of the diode, which we'll determine later. They had a 120 ohm resistor coming off of the diode. I didn't have that, so I went with a 100 ohm resistor. Shouldn't be no big deal. This will be our screen dropping resistor that will go to this point here, as well as our first filter capacitor. This will be our chassis ground for our isolation capacitor. And then this terminal will be our ground lug for the filter capacitor, and then this green wire going to the screen grid of the output tube will connect to this final terminal. And then our 30 microfarad cap will go there, and then this amp will be done, hopefully. Okay, the amplifier is nearly complete, except for installing the dropping resistor ahead of the rectifier diode. And as you can see, I've installed terminal strips to facilitate mounting of the new filter capacitors, as well as the new diode and the soon-to-be installed dropping resistor. Now, the original filter capacitor was a 3-section device that included a 50 microfarad and a 30 microfarad, both at 150 volts, and a 10 microfarad at 25 volts capacitor for the cathode of the audio output tube. Now, a question I get a lot, surprisingly a good bit, believe it or not, is if I have a 50 microfarad capacitor, can I replace it with a 47 microfarad, because I'm having a hard time finding a 50 microfarad? And the answer is yes, it will work just fine. In fact, 50 and 30 are not standard values anymore, so it's perfectly permissible to use a 47 in place of a 50 and a 33 in place of a 30, etc., and make sure your working voltage is equal to or greater than the working voltage rating of the capacitor that you're replacing. You never go under. And of course, always make sure you're installing your capacitors correctly. Electrolytic capacitors are polarity sensitive, and if you install one backwards, then you're going to have some undesirable results. And on modern capacitors, the negative terminal of the capacitor is denoted by a striped band on the side of the capacitor, as you can see here. And we just simply tie the negative terminals of the capacitor together and connect them to the negative common ground in the device that you're working on. Now there is one exception to the working voltage rule, where it's usually advisable to use a capacitor with a higher working voltage rating than what the original working voltage of the old capacitor was. Let's say you've got a solid state, a tube device that uses a solid state rectifier, whether it be selenium or silicon. Don't matter if it's a radio or TV or record player or whatever. When you first energize that device, the B+ voltage seen at the filter capacitor or capacitors is going to be extremely high because the tubes have not warmed up yet and started conducting. And that voltage is going to be high for anywhere from 15, 20, 25, 30 seconds, maybe even 45 seconds, until those tubes start conducting and place a proper load on the power supply and bring the voltage back down to a reasonable level. Now the old capacitors, such as what came out of this little amplifier here, had a surge voltage rating, even though that voltage is often not marked on the capacitor container itself. But what that means is the capacitor was designed to take a momentary high surge voltage for 20 or 30 seconds without causing damage to the capacitor. And I found that these newer capacitors are not like that. If the capacitor is rated for 160 volts, they mean 160 volts. They don't ever want to see any voltage greater than that being applied to them. And in the case of this record player, when you first turn it on and have a B+ voltage, say in the 170 to 175 volt range before the tubes warm up, and after a while those 160 volt modern capacitors are going to break down and go pop on you. So that's why it's always a good idea to go up on your working voltage for your new capacitors on solid state rectified tube equipment. And in this case we use 250 volt capacitors, and that's plenty enough headroom that they'll withstand the high B+ voltage that will be present until the tubes warm up and start conducting. Black capacitor here, that's our modern day AC safety capacitor that's replacing the Bumblebee chassis isolation capacitor. You can see I have one end connected to the ground bus and the other end connected to chassis. And the yellow capacitor is our 0.047 microfarad capacitor for our tone circuit. One end connects to the plate of the output tube, the other end connects to the end of this tone control pot, and then the center of the tone control pot connects to ground. As far as determining what value of dropping resistor to put ahead of this diode, there's a couple of ways I can do that. We want to see, according to the schematic, about 125 volts at the cathode of the original selenium rectifier, and we want to adjust our resistor value so that voltage is approximately the same on the cathode of this silicon diode after the set warms up. I could just measure the current across here from, so let me state that another way. I could measure the current drop across the points where the resistor would go, and then use Ohm's law to figure out how much big of a resistor I need to give me the necessary voltage drop. Or the easiest way for folks who are not very mathematically inclined like myself, and I don't have my calculator down here, is I can just simply try several resistors until I get one that gives me the right voltage output here at the cathode of the rectifier. And for me that's easy because I have a resistance substitution box that will allow me to switch in various values of resistors, and I can start at say 100 ohm and work my way down until I get about 125 volts at the cathode of the rectifier here. And for something like this, a 2-watt resistor is usually plenty big enough. I've used 2-watt resistors in these little phono amplifiers, and they generally don't even get hot. And on the subject of resistors, I'm using all flame-proof film type resistors, and that way if something does short out and cause one of the resistors to overheat and burn open, it'll just burn open and that'll be it. There won't be no flame fest like there would be with the old carbon composition resistors. I can't tell you how many of these things I've opened up and seen where the selenium rectifier had shorted and caused the series resistor to go up in smoke, which left a big black mess all in the chassis and sometimes even on the cabinet inside of the set. Now, when installing a diode, it's very important to observe correct polarity. This is our AC coming in here, and then we'll have our dropping resistor between here and the unbanded end of the diode. That's the anode end. The AC comes in there, and our banded end, the cathode end, is where our DC comes out. And that's the way you want to have the diode oriented for a positive voltage power supply. You do not want to insert the diode in backwards, otherwise you're going to have an unpleasant surprise. The only time you have a diode inserted in backwards with the AC connected to the cathode side is if you're building a power supply that outputs a negative voltage, and in that case you would have the positive terminals of the filter capacitor connected to circuit ground. But in this tube radios and record players and such as that, we rarely ever encounter power supplies like that. It's pretty much all going to be positive voltage. Okay, we have my resistance substitution box connected here where between the AC power cord and the anode band of the anode end of the diode. We have our DC voltmeter connected to the cathode of the diode. I already have a resistance value to give me 128 volts. Now, I'm going to show you what this is going to do whenever I turn it on. Notice the B plus jumped up to about 171 volts there. Bring this up closer to 120 volts. Okay, with 120 volts line input, we've got 131 volts at the cathode of the diode. So 5 volts higher than what the schematic calls for will be fine. That won't be any problem at all. Now, let's see what value resistor we have selected here. Okay, 150 ohm. That's a little higher than what I figured it would be, but that's what we're going to go with. I mean, results don't lie. Alright, here we are with the resistor in place. The volume is turned all the way up and the input terminals of the amp are touching the speaker. That's the reason it's making that buzzing sound. And this resistor is just barely getting warm, so that 2 watt one should do just fine there. Alright, let's put the amp back in and move on to the cartridge. Alright, amplifier is reattached to the motor board. Volume up. Good buzz. And our tone control is working, so the amp is fixed. Now let's check the cartridge. How much you want to bet it's dead as a doornail. Okay, the cartridge is connected. Does it have any life? Not really. What I'm getting is just I'm just getting a hum from. No life at all. That noise you heard was my finger touching the needle, which apparently there's some leakage through that cartridge, providing a path to the amplifier. And This cartridge is dead. Okay, this is the cartridge. It's indeed a Shure. I've seen these in a couple of different varieties, a 1-volt variety and a 3-volt variety. I had an old Caliphone one time that had the 1-volt variety in it, and miraculously it was still good. Unfortunately, the same can't be said for this one. Okay, just blur out. Well, it's still going to blur out on me. What's wrong with you? Finally, I hope you can see the Made in USA sticker on there, or molding into the plastic rather. Well, just out of curiosity, I'm going to go check this on the internet and just see what I can find. If I find any at all, I'm sure they'll be grossly overpriced, but I just want to see. And then we're going to change this over to a 89T most likely. Okay, have an 89T cartridge temporarily attached. And as you can tell, we have output now. Okay, I looked on the internet and didn't really have any luck finding a cartridge. Of course, I didn't really look too hard, but this tone arm and cartridge, like I've already said, was made by Shure. And this was known, I believe this tone arm was known as the Glider. And it was introduced in about 1947 or so, and continued to be made through into the 50s, obviously. And I think there was actually a version of this tone arm that had a General Electric variable reluctance magnetic cartridge in it. It's certainly capable of tracking light enough for a magnetic cartridge. But we're going to put an 89T in here and be done with it. Here's the tone arm removed from the phonograph. It just makes it easier for me to work on it with it out of the phonograph. It's made out of aluminum, and here's our counterbalance spring. They don't give you much leeway for adjustment, although I'm sure I could slightly bend this stake here to the front or to the back to alter the tracking pressure, but we won't mess with that until we put the new cartridge in and see what the tracking pressure is. Old rotten piece of foam that they have jammed in here to help hold the spring in place and most likely to keep vibration down. I won't worry with that either unless I just have to. Okay, since this is now going to be connected to a cartridge bracket that the whole thing will turn when we flip from LP to 78, that means there will be more stress on the wires, so I ran some heat shrink tubing over the connections to give it some strain relief. And since these are flat cartridge connectors, I'm just going to slide them up onto the terminals on the 89T bracket holder and just solder them in place, and then they should be good to go. Alright, there it is. That's not really the way you're supposed to do it. You're supposed to solder the wires directly to the cartridge holder terminals, but I did it this way to make it a little bit more secure, and unfortunately in the process one of my contacts came loose, so with enough solder that I put on there, that ought to hold it in place, and when the cartridge is inserted, it holds the contact where it's supposed to be, so should be no issues there. Okay, this gets plenty loud enough.
You're making me such a happy guy.
Now this particular cartridge only has a good 78 needle, and that's the side I was using, so no, it's not going to sound quite as good with that as it would a proper 1 mil needle, but I'll look through my junk. I think I've got a cartridge that I can use that has a good LP and 78 sides. Alright, that's on the LP side, but it's pretty worn down. In fact, I'm surprised it's even tracking the record. Okay, I've got two of the a static LP78 flip variety, soon to be one whenever I install this one in this record player. And then I've got two of the static 81Ts that are dual LP, and that's it. About a year or so ago, I found an static 81T on eBay that was listed for, I think, $11.95 with free shipping or something like that. Well, I thought I was just buying one cartridge, so I bought it. And then, much to my surprise, when the package came, it was two sleeves of brand new ones. And I think one of them was defective. All of the rest of them I've used, except the ones I've mentioned. So, yeah, I'd like to find a deal like that again. I mean, I remember back in the 90s when I was buying the gold-colored PRB branded ones from the local parts house. They always kept plenty of them in stock because the local school district was buying them like crazy to put in their Caliphone record players. Some of them were LP, and some of them were LP 78, but there was no marking on the package to indicate which was which. But they were $5 and some change, I believe, and I was buying them up until the early 2000s when the local school district decided to dump all of their record players, and the parts house quit getting the cartridges in, and then ever since then they've just been going up and up and up. To my knowledge, the only ones that's currently made are the red fan steel 911 D7 variety, and I will not use those unless it's maybe in some talking book player or something. Those don't track well, and they only reproduce one channel of a stereo record, whereas this old static cartridge will combine the left and right for mono. And then you've got the green static 911 S3 that's a 78 only cartridge. Now I've used those in my 78 players, but the old static originals like this are rapidly drying up, and the ones you find are usually expensive, in the range of $25 to $40, depending on who you get it from. And most of these only have a sapphire tip on them, which means in about 80 to 100 hours of use, you're going to be changing the cartridge again. I'm really trying to get away from that type of cartridge, but on some of these types of players here, this is really the best kind of cartridge to use without having to build a preamp stage. And the way this chassis is designed, it's really not conducive to add another tube socket or a printed circuit board for a solid state stage. So let's plug this in and see if it's any good. Hopefully it is. Yeah, this one's got a date stamp of September of '76 on it, but hopefully it's still okay. These cartridges came out in the late 50s, and they were mainly used in school record players, but in the early years, a lot of them were used in consumer-grade models, and they were used in school record players right up until probably around 2004 or 5, whenever Caliphone quit making the traditional type school record player and just switched over to a rebadged Crosley. And then, they were a good idea. They were cheap and they were easy to change, and if you broke the needle or the cartridge went bad, you just unplugged the whole thing and plugged in a new one and you were good to go. And that was really ideal for something that would be used by kids or teachers, giving it rough handling. I just really wish somebody would start making these things again, because there's still literally jillions of these types of players out there that use this type of cartridge. And I wish somebody would start making the mounting bracket again, because these types of cartridges are ideal for these types of record players. Yeah, this is probably one of the loudest one-tube wonders that I've ever had, and I think that's probably due to the output tube, which I believe is a bit higher gain than say, a standard 25C5. And I did some more checking on that original cartridge, and it seems to me its substitute is a Electro Voice 56, which is an early plug-in cartridge. It has an output of about 1.5 volts, similar to an 89T, so that cartridge may not be as high of an output as what I thought it was. Alright, let's try 78 now. This is one of the RCA new orthophonic high fidelity ones from the mid-50s. Sounds very nice.
I went a-riding home down to Santa Fe. There's been a lot of changes since I've been away. I went to...
Here's an older 78, probably from the 20s, maybe earlier, I don't know, and it's even doing good with that one. Oh, that record's so hot, it's rattling the cabinet.
If we follow and do right, and the paths of sin we fight, soon we'll stand the bank of Jordan in a robe as white as snow. Some beautiful day up there in the
Now it's time to take the mechanism apart, clean it, and lubricate it. This is an older Alliance mechanism, and this wheel has a divot in it from where somebody failed to put it in neutral when not in use. This is the older style wheel, and I'm going to have to get it rebuilt one day. I'm not going to show all the details of this, but we'll take the spindle out, which is held in place by a clip underneath, clean the spindle, clean the bushing with contact cleaner, and then re-lubricate it with white lithium grease with a few drops of Zoom spout oil mixed in with it to kind of free it up some, or it won't be quite so stiff. Put that back in there, take the wheel off, move it out of the way, clean all this up, and clean this track here with contact cleaner and alcohol, and then re-lubricate that with a little bit of white lithium grease. Pull all this off, clean the shaft off, and put a drop of Zoom spout oil on that. Do the same thing for the idler wheel shaft, clean it up and put a drop of oil on that. Take the motor apart, disassemble it and all that good stuff. Clean the bushings out with alcohol and Q-tips. If this was really gunked up, I'd soak them in acetone overnight. Re-lubricate with Zoom spout, put the motor back in, and tap on the motor as you're reassembling it to align the bushings, and then it should be good to go. And I'll inspect these motor mounts. I may go ahead and replace them while I've got it apart if they seem to be hard in any way, but I'm not going to show all that. You've seen me do it 100 times anyway, so we'll just make this a little bit shorter. I really like this mechanism better than the newer Alliance mechanism because it uses the bigger clips that are easier to get off and put back on without them getting lost. Not the gunkiest mechanism I've ever seen, but it's certainly a bit gunky and needs to be cleaned. Well, looking at this wheel, I can see that it's been changed before. It has a Wasco aftermarket wheel. And where's the divot? Right there. Yep, that could have been avoided had somebody not left it in gear. But after the first of the year, I'll probably send this off and have it rebuilt. I'm not doing anything now because it's screwed up as the post office is. I send this in to have it rebuilt. It's liable to get lost in the mail, and then I've got to scramble around and try to find another wheel. At least with this wheel, I can still use it. Oh yeah, let's see how leaky the two caps were that we pulled out. First, the Bumblebee chassis isolation capacitor. Yep, that one's a bit leaky. Could be a lot worse, but still too leaky to really use, especially in that application. Now let's check the white Goodall ceramic cased tone by tone capacitor. Well, it's still pretty good, actually. Might save it for use in a resurrection. Checking the battery in my old meter. 5.9 volts. Yeah, that's kind of low, isn't it? Okay, on this meter it reads 6.1 volts. But the main problem I'm having with this meter is, like I've mentioned before, if I can make it do it on camera, see if I hold it at an angle and it looks more pronounced in person, it appears that the whole display is energizing. See, there you go, you can see it better there. I have to hold it at a certain angle to get the true representation of what I want to see. So I don't know what to do to fix that. So I guess this meter is just going to be a backup meter, or in case I lose the new meter, like I lost the zoom spout oil, or in case I need 2 meters for something, I'll have this one I can pull out in a pinch. But I don't know what we're going to do about this display, if that can even be fixed. Or whatever it is connection related, because if I press in on the display, the condition almost goes away, but whenever I let the display go, remove the pressure, it comes back. So we may tear into this and see if I can fix it. But looking at the meter again, I've got the display tilted up, and it's definitely in this display, because you can see when I press on it, it just goes berserk there. So it's got 4 little tiny Phillips head screws holding that display together. So I think we'll take that apart and see if we can do anything about it. Okay, I've got the display out. All I know to try is to attempt to clean the contacts up on this ribbon cable and on the display, and maybe it'll make better connection and work. Other than that, it's not really much I can do with this. Oh, now it's worse. Garbage can. Okay, the meter is now in file 13, and the only thing I saved off of it was this 9-volt battery snap. Occasionally we need one of those to replace a broken snap in a piece of equipment, mainly little pocket transistor radios, such as this little Viscount right here. Here's the inside of it. It looks like a cheap, typical late 60s pocket transistor radio. And it works, but the volume's a bit weak.
They do set traps. If people are having problems with those type of animals,
maybe one day we'll do a repair video on this, but for right now, let's get back to the record player. Here's the motor apart, and I'm going to say one thing about these Alliance motors. If you get one that's stuck, frozen, won't move, do not try to force these bushing assemblies off, because if you do, you're going to pull the bushing clean out of this little bottom piece here, and once you pull it out, you're not going to get it back in there. So if you get one that's stuck, you're going to have to use heat to free it up, and then once you pull it off, then you can clean it up really well and then re-lubricate it, and it should be fine. These old motor mounts are rotten, so we might as well just go ahead and replace them while we're in. And I thought we'd take a look at our original Motorola Golden Voice speaker before we put this back together. And yeah, the plane's flying over, but he can't see what I'm doing today. I'm in the shop, so hate to disappoint him. Alright, motor's back in. We're tracking at 6.3 grams. This cartridge is designed to track between 6 and 8, so that's at the lower end of the range, and it seems to track okay, and that's where we're going to leave it. I'm not messing with that spring. Okay, we're almost ready to go, and I found a wheel that I think will work. Let's see if it will. Nope, that wheel won't fit. The center hole's too small, so we're going to have to endure this bumpy wheel until I get until I decide to send the old one off and have it rebuilt. Well, I looked on the VM site for this wheel, and $28 to have it rebuilt, or $36 outright purchase. Fortunately, this is one of those wheels that I can buy outright, because by the time I paid the post office $7, $8, $9 for priority shipping to have this old wheel shipped to them, I could just go ahead and buy the $36 one that's ready to go and just swap it out. And one other thing I did, the speed control lever was bent downward to the point where it was rubbing on the motor board, and I straightened it back out, so because I've seen these where it was bent downward and it would literally rub the paper covering off the motor board, and we don't want that, so that problem's taken care of. Now let's put the platter back on, and hopefully we're done with this, except for getting another wheel for it. Okay, we're operational again, but of course we have the thump 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 noise and not a lot of torque because that old rubber is just not gripping as it should. But it'll work for now.
But I'm so afraid of losing you again.
And as I'm sure most of you have heard, we lost Charlie Pride. It seems like we're losing all of the old school entertainers that truly knew how to entertain. So in his memory, I thought we'd roll a little Charlie Pride in this video.
You brought the sunshine in the summer of our love, and like the and the only thing I say I own is a bunch of children and a wife. Now this old house I live in, it ain't nothing but a shack. But somehow I always manage to drive me a brand new Eldorado Cadillac. Back door.
Yeah, this one here by the McGuire sisters, I have it on 78. And actually the 78, I believe, sounds better, which is no surprise.
When an irresistible force touches you, me, and me, I know you, and me, darling, you, and it works for a penny, trying to get a fish on the line, in a coffee that I always dreamed of.
Okay, that sounds good.
When I cried for your kiss.
And last with the 78, the B-side of, they were doing the Mambo, which is Mr. Sandman by Vaughn Monroe.
Mr. Sandman, bring me a dream, make her complexion.
And I'll have to say, out of all of the one-tube wonder record players that I've worked on, this one's probably the best sounding one. It's amazing how manufacturers can go from one basic circuit to another and make some little minor changes, and one manufacturer's record player will sound vastly superior to the other manufacturers. And I think in this case it was them using a better speaker and using the higher gain output tube is what did it. So there you go, another one saved and more to come later. And I'll end this video with this. My bottle of 91% isopropyl alcohol is just about empty. And who would have ever thought that the time would come when a bottle of this stuff would be worth more than the record player that we used this stuff to clean. You know, I've had the heck of a time, actually no luck at all, finding this in any store since all of this mess started. And the times I've looked on eBay for it, there's people price gouging it. And there's other people actually bidding up the auction listings to ludicrous levels. Now me, I like financial progression as much as the next guy, but I couldn't in clear conscience put a bottle of rubbing alcohol on eBay for some ludicrous price just because I know there's a high demand for it right now, and just because I could do it and get away with it. I just couldn't do that. So hopefully we'll be able to find some of this stuff for a reasonable price again very soon, and otherwise I'm going to have to come up with something else to do my cleaning with.